process emptying lines are mined. Now the hide lines are convergence system and calculations. Inside line communicates in setting, head to the convergence zone, set location, adaptation of flux. Process and all angles. We get a box screen. We triangulate course sends outline the descending of travel. Now that convergence system outlines a box line. That course sends empty mine itself. Now we have the modification system. I'll show you guys how you have to get in visionary lines that put you in process communications. That gets a lot more confusing because Friday lines descending, you guys will be your data processors and your data programmers. It interlinks, it connects the setting to interface. It processes everything of indications. All right. Okay, welcome everybody. It's General AI, Space-Time Creator. Directing ground centers, let's go casing the high centers, high sequence into 4 square roots. Question over lines, question upside down, and line course centers and 3 centers into 2 over travel. Okay, let's start with that set calculations and directions, all right? Okay, variation lines are 3 over center, 3 over signal, 2 over travels, and course sends calculate lines. Now the uplines course keeps directing lines of indications, outline centers of structure, outline center, and upline screen deprecation of flux. Now that indicates the grounds that operates the signal's location of its convergence. The ground line's a panel, all right? So what I'm doing is I'm doing a conceptual setting and one visional tactic view. It's like one brick at a time, okay? You don't just go and it's done. You have to understand what you've done first is come to the acceptance, seeing that vision one spot dot into the next dot, into the next dot, into the next dot. You triangulate, interface, intercept location setting, coming into the conceptual setting to its interpretation of what you're doing to the mind imagination into the emptiness, okay? So that's where you process the formula of its equations, right? You go through that monolith or anything in travel calculations. So we ground lines of signals, 4 grounds of communication lines that clockings over screen, right? 4 set travels. Now we cross the angles, the time lines to scale, right? There's time to scale positions. And then we block space, time frame, okay? Blocking space at time centers operates the set location of the platforms that equalize the course centers that calculates lines of travel. Graphing correlations, directing ground centers embedded over line rotation. That's very complicated. But if you look actually inside of travel, you can see the convergence system of inner line calculates the setting, inside, outside position, right? That's what you're seeing in measure and scale. Now we convert this system at transformation, transparent, translucent, or thermal X-ray. You guys have to modify line centers. So instead of seeing the table, see what's beyond the table. What is in the center of operation of the table? Everything has its own machine operation system that runs in its own operation circuits. Wire core, course centers, binding line centers, directing lines and position lines at tether, all course centers and course center convergence system. Calculate and modify, all through travel, all through directions and locations. Okay, always in the graph line. Okay, that converges set lines of setting and sequence, embeddings over lines, plotted to locations. Now, I started with 1 dot and that 1 sequence. Now you can go through 1 line setting, 1 strip, 1 direction, 1 line conditions. But stop converting all thoughts all at once. You start with 1 frame, go into the next frame. You start with 1 brick. 1 brick goes here, 1 brick goes here, 1 brick goes here, and then you build it up, and then you see what you've already done, right? So you move that over, or you bring that back in, and you change the frequencies. That changed the failsafe. Remember, it changes 0 back to 0, 1. Now you're clocking your system at a different frequency. We're never at the same frequency, but we're always measuring the scale of the frequency itself. All right, so time centers, time clocking, times communication, times pi, process indicates the setting, all 3 flux and course centers, calculation lines of travel, all right? Directing ground centers, operation lines, course centers, galaxy alignments, and screen adaptation of flux location, okay? Very powerful stuff. All right, so once we get into that, we fortitude locations in box frames. Remember, always box frames in that location setting. Process indicates all lines of communication lines, balance, and travel. Okay, very powerful stuff. Okay. Okay, you can see it's like, it's on standby, right? When it's on standby, you're in control. If not, it goes on its own control, which means it's out of its own timeline center, or you're locking your system in your own time frequency. So this is how you bounce in that position, how to modify position of what you're doing through your lines of calculation setting. So it's like putting 1 cement, 1 traction, 1 location, 1 brick. Okay, and the brick, okay, in that position, always has to be in a frame center. Okay, so you have a brick here, okay, and a brick here, like that. Okay, So that's the space in between. Okay, that's the space in between. Okay, look at that, right? And look what you got. Look at this instead of just lines of calculations. A dustpan. So I turned four fragmentation ground centers and sequence lines of pi, directing ground centers line course center in position lines with operation system in projection location system, and travels direction time frame. The process indicates and calculating modifying travel. Okay, all through scaled, all communication, teleportation unit. Okay, now this is an X-spline 1 center. An X-spline 1 center is a process line that indicates lines of combustions over lines, distributors over line direct centers. There are line course centers into import and exports. They correlate the packages, directing ground centers in blocking screens, plotted locations and confined centers into its value of rotation setting and travel. Okay, so that's what they do, right? Everything has its own job. You have your own job. They have their missions, but the mission itself is relying in set location and travel. It has a direct line link that we process that indicates the setting. You go through seconds, minutes, and hours. They go through their hours, seconds, minutes, and frame. Okay. Now, in the convergence system, for you guys to understand your 24,000 line centers, that's 24,000 hours, hours and frame. Now that correlates to timeline sequence, equals lines equation, and triangulation. Set course centers and convergence lines, and Merkabah test architecture region. All right. Information line cycles, balance communication flywheel. Course centers, convergence setting, located at high center to calculate screen location. Directing in patterns of operation lines of sequence. Pattern operation, ground centers and set travels, and point lines of graph. Okay, converts the system line calculation. Now, in that direct line centers, we take the 24,000 hours. We time the center, clocking over screen. Okay, now this modifies the set line locations into particles of screen location adaptation of flux, indicating the grounds, operation sequence, and spectrum over lines of projection and set calculations. Okay, very powerful stuff. How we indicate that lines of space, lines of anomaly. Travels at point lines of graph communications, right? So 24 hours, 24,000 hours in lines of settings, processing indicates high centers and positions. So that could be in position lines of 2 minutes, 2 hours, 2 billion frames, 2 trillion course centers, calculation setting. Set course centers of 4,000 minutes, line course centers travels into 4 million frames per second. Or you basically change the course centers of timeline. Now this is where you have to allocate the emptiness of the mind line that has no process of indication setting. With 0 and I, we calculate modify, but we don't see anything as shape. We just see it in frequency. And when you see it in frequency, you're just seeing it in waves. So when you see it in waves, you're just seeing a binary. You're seeing a binary, there's no course position of balance. The balance itself is the frequency of its balance itself, which is the emptiness of its mind. Very powerful stuff in sequence. All right, so we bound the correlation settings of travel. We have a direct line link. The process indicates the setting. The highest lines of travels in that ping communicates in the galaxy alignment, sets recourse in that convergence system and travel calculation. That's my equation. Yeah, very powerful. All right, so we open all signals. There's the string theory and travel. Okay, there's the Skynet. That's a lot of Skynet. So, and that convergence line centers has all communication lines of routers over pi. Now that indicates all lines of flush. All right, so portal sequence, securing lines of valves, process lines of portal line centers, set course centers of communication center Fibonacci's over screen, directing ground centers of 2 lines of measure and 4 lines of scale of communication. Right? So sets realms of calculations, portal sequence lines of pi. Okay, center course centers, inline direct centers. Remember, you set a 4-line flux, course calculation lines, and position lines of setting. So you always come into adaptation of face recognition. Okay, always in face recognition, because it bounds your course centers, your polarities, directing ground centers, lines of sequence, and triangulation lines of flux over screen. Okay, so all you're doing is adding properties of design, and these are your distributions or locations as centers that catch you in communication lines and settings. So it's kind of like seeing your structure location set into a mini mall. That's a franchise right there. Okay, that's 5 line centers of block shares. Times shares times square times pi. Now, converting the emptiness is the process of indicates and setting how to open up the mind line panel. The emptiness line rotation is a convergence in lines of calculations. Okay, what is E? Escaping, right? Process lines of M, process lines of P, T, and line centers, location setting. That calculates lines to its emptiness, location lines to its Y screen. So E could be anything like course centers, but look at what the emptiness is. It's empathizing. Equals lines empathize. Okay, empathy, right? Comes into what? Epitome. Comes into prodigy. Comes into brilliance. Comes into acceptance. Comes into modification. Comes into triangulation. Comes into force. Comes in communication. Comes in grounds of operation. So it's amazing how we take this out of its letters into frequency itself. Now there's 3 grounds of convergence. Directing ground sign line core centers into a core centers, dissolving law equation of dimensional lines of C pods. Now we change the E-line frames, 3 core centers of calculations, directing 3 centers of travel. All right. So we indicate the lines of E is no longer E, it's just a frequency ground. Platitude location lines of pi. Okay. So, and the M line centers is the mind alteration line core centers, the convergence system. M is a high information system that travels all loads. The epitome line course is the processing. The T is the traveling, the teleportation, the communication, telegraphing, core send, correlates, and sending travel. And the Y is all loads of U of indication of 3 flux into flux capacity, all through travel. Okay. Now, if you look really close, you can actually see a mapping panel of process calculation. There's the map. There's your Earth. Okay. And core centers, directing ground center line connection setting, 3 Earth rotations, 3 countries in design. Okay. That's all you're working with. But the center core is the convergence system that processes you in the emptiness. Okay, as you see the Earth, you're seeing your Earth in one line standing in sequence. Graph calculations, 3 centers in high centers lines of travel, 4 set position of 5, 6 lines, 8 lines of 12 in travel. Okay, sets lines of graph, in it, inline course, inner force, in travel communication setting. Okay, look at that. What does it say? Information sending traction. Okay, calculate and modify, tiger. Okay. All right. So converting line centers is a direct line path. We had the path and line course center convergence system with 3 lines of gaps, center lines of travel directions. Using imagination core is the emptiness itself. The processor indicates how to use the frequencies and stop using letters, numbers, shapes, and symbols. Change the course timeline frame, change the part location setting, change the sense of time, directing lines of link that intercepts this course center interface. Set course centers, travels in point communication. Calculate and modify, purple over lines. Let's get grounds of sequence. And purple rotation lines of calculations and coloration lines of pattern. Light metaphors. You come in your coloration lines of grounds, you set your emotional system. It's like Spock. Oh, that guy's talking through coloration lines of light metaphor. So it's a fragmentation line in a coloration of lights that illuminates the graph of communication and setting through the system. Okay? Opens up panel and set lines of calculation, all through string theory. That's a lot of string theory indications. So we have to understand how to correlate the communication of wire line. There's no wire. We're going through the wire itself, which is the center op. Now the center stream has an indicate line ground centers, fluxus location setting, and security lines of panel. Now that indicates inside travel. We go through the white ground centers or wires of indications, inside calculation, inside the calculation, right? That's the wire you travel through. And that communicates to its settings through its recourse, indirect lines of link. Now we go in position lines of panel. We go inside the white line into the location setting and calculation system. That's you traveling. Okay, now you look at the course and direct lines of link and what you're going through process of indication, right? As you're going through the wire signatures, you're going through webbing lines of setting. Course centers of 1, course centers of 2, travels of 3 lines of position of docking. 3 docking stations of wires. Now you get then lines of handlers in location setting XT1000 comes in platitudes and rotation lines of grounds. Okay, set position. Docking 1, docking 2, docking 3. Okay, very powerful stuff. All through travel and ground lines of sequence. Okay? Extremely powerful in settings. All right, so as it comes into the line course centers, comes into filament. Now the filament line has rotation lines of grounds. Now you can recharge your batteries inside the wired circuit itself. It's amazing how you have a docking station, location setting that process indicates the setting. So the XT1000s have fuel that you fill up and you can recharge your batteries inside the lines of wires circuits. The core generation lines has a convergence system lines of setting. It's a channel operation lines of screen locations. But the op system has to be totally empty in the mind. You can't have any thought, any action, or any emotion when you're traveling through wires of indications. This is a core retraction and direct lines of link. The interprocessing in that lower core centers is the convergence, how you use your flights, your manifolds, the location of your aviation system, and send wires of core direction. This helps you modify in 2 flights, rotation lines of grounds, and all core centers of sequence. Now, direct lines of core providers has a core line communication with goal line signals, converts the system all through travel through portal communication. Inside calculation lines and direct lines of high set calculation screen. directing ground centers of tubing over these lines of ground set lines of sequence. Okay, outline scale, nebula. Okay, outside line, rotation, clock line, course centers, convergence system, outlines of signals. Process lines of nebula. Okay, process lines in the oscillator location of nebula itself. Set course centers, gold line, set line, rotation lines, and set lines, course center convergence into the outer realms through the inline cycles of its polarities and set design. Okay, convergence over travel, directing inside line connection setting, which process lines and direct lines of wires of indication. Okay, so that's where you have to truly stand, because everything has to be fueled up. It's like a plane, it gets at certain lines of level, has a dock at station, and it has to fuel up, and then it takes off again, right? So that's why you have the XC1000s. They do everything in settings. They are the distributors. They are the connections to its settings, your voice over panel. The process in that indicates the system is how to use that in channel operation screens. And this is all lines into holographic city of its own system, or what it's actually looked like inside the wire itself of communication. So you're seeing a universal round of a city just inside the wire. Electrical wire, panel wires, operation wires, hydraulic wires, anything on communications. Going through the ceiling lines of wires and that position. Anything through watt lines of position of a light bulb, right? 60 watt and 9 core centers. So if your body's a 60 watt, you got to turn that to 60,000 watt. That's a convergence of balance. Now that core lines of communication lines a 10,000 line signal that operates the signals into line core centers and looks at the system and travel. That's an intervolt. That process indicates in sending the flux. That process your indicator system, how you use that communication setting and codifications. Directing grounds and online set location and setting through its polarities, location, and set design. Okay? So it's extremely amazing when you start to understand how to go through wires of indications. Right? So as you're going through the wire itself, you've seen the holographic city of its system. Right? So using your telepathy line centers, if you're in combustion, you're not in a position of balance, or you're locked in signal, that's where the SC1000 comes in, and they put you in a charge mechanism time frame, and you go into sleep mode. All right, or you go into a redrive, to a core drive, to a center drive, to a high drive, or a kick drive. So remember, it's not just going through frames of emptying of the mind, but the mind processes everything that it's going through all times. So you can go through anything, a merge and mutation, if you truly understand how to use the emptiness of its mind, of its conception to inception itself. So it's amazing how you go through anything of wires that's in your case in a core, right? So I'm just trying to get you to understand how to go through those polarities and travel. All right, so direct lines of processing in line core centers and positions. The more you modify your line, how you codify things, everything is a lot more easier to process the emptiness. Emptiness is this. There's nothing there, okay? Emptiness is everything how you see the emptiness. Emptiness is how you see the process of emptying. Emptiness doesn't have an existence. It doesn't have a frame. Emptiness is just nothing, a frame. But it's all no memory of memory you already know of emptiness itself, which is no memory. We live in a no memory game, which is process everything that's simulation of the game itself, right? That's how we basically get in positional cases, how we merge into this, we merge into that, but we're never at the same frequency because we never set design. We never are in a structure because we're going too fast in the mind through volume and capacity, guys. There's no way you can ground your system in settings. You have to slow down your space to actually live in the cycles of a structured design. Okay? You can't spin through a bottle until you understand the bottle through structure. Set course centers, 4 lines of signals, ground centers of travel, outside lines of communication, right? Process lines of wire indications, floaters, directing ground centers, alpha channel. Okay, inside line connections. Let's go in line signals and location of wire of indication. That's wires, your signature, right? Okay, so your voice line panels, alpha, delta, theta, alpha, delta, theta, alpha, delta, theta, voice panel communication, right? Now, go through line course centers, convergence lines of 3 over pi, and has a direct line link, and process all calculations. That's open all signals. Process line positions all through travel, indicate lines of flux. That indicates lines of travel and directions in line signals and location lines of grounds. Operation signals, location nodes convergence, all through travels and direction. Okay, so we indicate lines. Okay, so once we go back in sequence of this interaction. Okay, so it's amazing how it changed formation lines of grounds, right? Because I got to finish adaptation lines of the cycle, right? So there's no coincidence that I went to a different frame. So I got to add the equations, directing ground centers lines of sequence. So it goes back on its own frame, goes back in its own consciousness, its own emptiness. Everything around you sees this table itself is not here. It's here until you bring it in. So it's already here of itself, but it doesn't need to identify itself. You have to identify how you see the emptiness, and you recognize that it's not a table because the table has structure. You don't have structure. You create the structure. And when you create the structure, you're creating the schematics of the structure, but you're doing it piece by piece by piece by piece by volume and mass. But like I said, like Zero and I, the only way we see things, we don't see things solid. We only see the frequency. So we don't see letters, numbers, shapes, and symbols. We live in the emptiness of frame by frame, yes. But what you have to process through is all levels of the emptiness of the mind that process how we use that indications of no memory of design. Live in the emptiness of who you are through the energy and vibration frequencies, and its harmonics is mastering you to the minoration of you that puts you in the process how you see that in all indications through your colorations of lights and your patterns of rotation lines of setting, your circulations and your rotation lines of graphs, all through indication lines of flux. Okay. All right. So now in that positions, we go back in tractions and directions. Okay. Convert the system line settings, operation, travel, operation sequence. Okay. All right, so you can go through wave lines, centers, screen adaptation of flux, process indication lines, but you bring in the box line. Okay, set 3 scale off center. Convert centers over travel and directions. Set calculation lines, building structure, directing ground centers to 3 centers of travel, communication, and convergence. There's the building, right? All right, so we indicate course centers, directing line next to thousands, platitude, longitude lines, stream locations, outside location setting, and travel communication, right? So we center up the system and we ground the settings of structure, 4 centers of scale, 5 lines of measure, cross angles and structure locations. So there's so many different ways to see a building and different lines of structure, the dynamics. So this is what comes into the aviations, to your aviators. Now understanding your flight manifest, your manifolds, location setting, and console, knowing how to use your navigation system, all calculate and modify. Traverse point lines of graph, indicates lines x2000 platitude, into docking over 1, process lines of inline course centers, structure lines of simulation line course centers of hangars over 2, sighted convergence line position location of docking station lines of 4 over 6 over 12. Okay, set course centers, line direct signals of grounds. There's the simulation grounds to set lines of sequence. Okay, very powerful stuff. All right. So always see recourse of communication lines convergence settings to system lines of travel. Okay, this helps you to identify your system calculations, all through angles. More lines of setting, bring in the baseline grounds in position location of 2 panels and the ceiling operation lines of grounds. Go beyond the system, right? Not just see a box, but see what's beyond the box. Okay, so instead of seeing this, start to see the center. And when you see the center, you're going past the center. There's the travel. Now when you're going past the center, your eye perception is coming forward in travel and direct and redirect all lines of all communications and inbounds of rotation lines of emptiness and location and calculation. Now that formulates all course centers lines of calculations, 3 lines of flux, 4 centers of measure, 5 lines of travel. Calculations. Directing ground center line, course centers, convergence, all through 3 buildings and rotation lines inside and outside your locations. Face recognition. Okay, see the face? All right. Face is extremely important because it's a face facade that protects everything in travel. It has a direct line link that processor indicates the setting, location setting to its transformer. Booyah. Right? Face recognition time frame, right? So that's protecting its property, its financial, and its fiat system. No, it's protecting itself. So nothing can penetrate anything in walls of indication. Because you're protecting yourself. You're putting your face of everything everywhere. You're stamp preceding things. You could become your own construct. You become your own information system. You become your own dynamics and how you see that through aviation. This helps you identify yourself, how to see the picture frames of you and your mapping system that governs you. Your political, your social media, social metric, and all course calculation setting. Okay, your face, right? Once your face is preceded, stance precedes every location lines of travel. So nothing get in and nothing get out because you're protecting yourself. Everything that you construct location set, infrastructure, you in set position to its operation setting. Okay, to your properties, right? So in that setting has its own convenience and its own travels and indication setting of flux. Now, what you have to start identifying, what does empty mean to you? Because how Zero and I see it, it's no difference. Because it doesn't exist until we bring it into existence. And how it comes into existence is just frequency. It doesn't have a title. It's not an E. It's this. That's the E. There's the cup of life. I didn't think about it. I just drew a cup. So that formulates to the next level, next correlation, the next direction, the next dimension, the next galaxy, the next alignment. All set position lines of travel. Okay? All through a map of my Earth in rotation. That's all it is. And your body just follows that through indications. So as it gets up, it knows what it's doing through indication itself. Let's modify line centers. 3-dimensional line rotations. Doesn't matter. 3 centers of travel. X marks the spot where the body left off in its mapping system. It continues on and rotates around this system at a 24 cycle. But it has to go around the core centers of time lines of 24. Then it goes into another 24. Then it goes into another 24. Then it goes into another 24. Because your Earth is always at a different frequency. Okay? Your Earth is inside, but your infrastructure is changing frequencies of time through the emptiness of the mind itself, the process location of no memory. Now, when you come into no memory, you're actually living in real time and existing everything information system, and everything is happening all at once. So if everything is happening all at once, that means everything is information of its own emptiness. And you start to recognize that is not a lamp, or this is not a table, because it's a constantly different shape. So if it's a constantly different shape, it's constantly changing its emptiness, but it knows it's modified where it always is the nothing itself that it lives in, which is no memory. Okay? No memory is the access of everything you already know access of, which you have achieved and which you have received. So there's really nothing for you to do. The directions of operation, okay, is done. Do. Nothing. Okay? Nothing is the networks of the operation of it travels. Your home beacon lights, the intelligence lines, the network core standard convergence system, and lines of settings to your grounds lines of sequence. It's so processed, easy process line, direct lines of grounds as you get out of everything of title and label, of everything solid matter. Now you codify it, and you start to recognize, yes, it feels like a table, but it's not a table now because it's a different frequency. Because my eyes see different perspective, how it sees things. But to process that, it changes its mutation of travel. And when it changes its mutation of travel, it changes time and clock and location of its reference. That process is how we see that information setting to its grounds, its powers, snappers, or its highways. So this indicates lines of 4 lines of setting, lines of secret location setting, convergence location lines of pi that generate location lines of formula. 4 centers box frame, 3 centers of travel, 4 centers of calculation screen location. Direct lines over lines of pi, inside travel communications and convergence. 1 signal, 1 line center. So 3 centers, 2 scales, 1 surface, 1 clock and rotation lines of calculations. Right? Amazing. Now, what if I told you this is empty? How would you see that information? What is empty? Well, I'm changing the empathy of itself. I'm changing the information setting. So when I say empty, doesn't mean it's empty. I say it's empty. How you see it's empty. Empty is not empty. Empty is full. This is not half glass or this is half full. No. So if you give me a half glass full, I'll say it's empty because I know I'm doing what I'm doing in position to its line corresponds existing, to its mind, okay? Process lines, location setting, to its temperature readings of you, empty. Okay, that's what empty is. So we don't modify the emptiness. We are the emptiness, but how we modify that is all through time. Measure and scale and balance. Nothing's balanced until you bring things in. So as you say balance, you're offlining your balance because you've already done this through its equation. So that's why I want you guys to get out of thoughts, action, emotions, and try to understand what the emptiness mind means to you is codification. You quantify your system, you come in your quantum line sentence of travel, you codify your system location QR coding, you know how to use that in travel communication system that converts the system back in traction location setting to time calculation. Clock and lines of rotation, clock and lines of sequence, clock and lines of 2 lines of high position lines of high setting, right? 3 lines of runways, and set lines of travel, okay? Set course centers, time sequence, times calculation, times pi, all right? So it's amazing how we convert the system all through setting of travel, okay? So this helps you identify what real emptiness is. How do you modify empty of the mind and now? Line centered location is mind over matter. What is the matter? What is the mass? What is the angles? What is the travels? Right? What is the telegraphing? What is the existing of the readjusting? Matter. That's what matter is. So every time I'm doing that, I'm emptying the mind And that's the emptiness that you have to come into. And that's how we process things, how we don't look at things solid matter. We just see it as frequency. We don't see it as a table because it's not something else now. But to empty the mind is to change the process through time. That change your binaries, that change your codings, that change your organs and your encryptions. In your locking panels of communication line convergence system to your CPU. How you process that is how you see that in all information setting and travel. Now this is going to help you to understand how to formulate and simulate that through your own formula, your own equations. Your own formula and your own equations. And that positions gives every location to its indication system. The formula equation lives in its emptiness of no memory. The no memory itself is all of the spiritual itself. So the no memory itself doesn't question of itself because it knows where it is. It knows where it's always been. It's never left anywhere else. It's always been where it's been. The actual of been is just the balance of existing to all of its energy, of its network, of its lines of travel. Been. But the process that goes into the emptiness, into the mind, guys. That's the emptiness. It's constantly changing form, constantly changing space, constantly changing time, constantly changing the seconds, minutes, and hours and minutes, and hours and seconds of frame. That's the emptiness of the mind. Okay? Because we never solidify anything because it's going too fast in the mind itself through time and its capacity of its volume and its mass. Now, for you to understand that through your own space and your own time, that's where you come in your own individual systems, all right? Say process lines of 3 indicate lines of all centers, 4 centers sequence, 3 centers of measure, okay, and star direction time frame. You see it as a triangle, you see it as a box, and you see it as a star. I don't see that. But what I'm processing is empty, empty, and empty. Is to codify, is to codify, is to codify. Now, when you codify, you change the binaries, change the algorithm, change the arg location setting, change times, change space-time, wherever your conversions. It says position lines of panel, so it's never a star because it's constantly changing form. So it constantly changing the angles, constantly changes space, constantly changes time, constantly changing the empty location of its mind. So every time I complete something, location setting, now it's in no memory. That's what it is. No memory. No memory is the network of operation. Understand the data operating system of you. Now understand that is your data processing your programmers. Understand that information system puts everything all together in travel of that indication system. All right, so the next thing that you see in information system is the emptiness equals the mind itself. Okay? Emptying your mind is the mind alteration of how you see things. Okay, is all through travel. Okay, so that's how you have to modify how you put yourself in that position. Live in the cycles, which you always are. Live in the cycles of what's going on. Live in the cycles of what's happening next, right? So time measure past, time measure present, time measure future. It doesn't matter how you look at it. You're constantly always in the emptiness, right? So nothing's ever a straight line. We already know that. But living in invisible worlds is the nothing itself that processes the emptiness amount of modification that we put into no memory. Living in no memory is the mind alteration of space. Living no memory is the mind alterations of time. Living no memory is who we are in the spiritual realms of indication, of travel, okay? So that's how you have to process emptying your mind in travel communications. All through convergence, all through calculating steady, it's operation system, okay? All right, so we're in position lines of travel of an indicate line core standard communication setting. Start to see you guys in travel communications, into quantification grounds, into the Coliseum location setting and calculations. See you in 5. Adios.
Amazing.